When I accidentally overheard my parents' private conversation with my wealthy brother, I didn't just discover they had placed the entire financial burden on my shoulders, I uncovered a chilling truth about how they measured my worth compared to his. Standing frozen outside that door, listening to them casually discuss making me pay for everything while protecting his precious bank account, I realized my entire life had been built on a lie. What happened next would shake our family to its very core. My name is Claire Monroe, and I'm 33 years old, teaching third grade at Maplewood Elementary in Illinois. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd be standing in front of 100 wedding guests exposing my family's deepest secrets, I would have laughed. Back then, I still believed in the fairy tale version of my childhood. Growing up, we lived in a 4-bedroom colonial on Elm Street, the kind of house that screamed middle-class American dream. Dad, Gerald Monroe, managed the local branch of First National Bank, while Mom, Linda Monroe, worked part-time at the town hall and gave piano lessons from our living room. The sound of scales and beginner pieces was the soundtrack of my childhood, mixing with the smell of Mom's famous chocolate chip cookies and the sight of Dad's perfectly manicured lawn. My brother Ethan is 4 years older than me, and from the moment I could form memories, he was the golden child. While I was finger painting and building fairy houses in our backyard, Ethan was already reading chapter books and solving math problems that made Mom's eyes light up with pride. "Look at this," she'd say, holding up his perfect report card like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Straight A's again. This boy is going places." I remember being 7 years old, proudly showing my parents a watercolor painting I'd done of our house. I'd spent hours getting the shutters just right, mixing the perfect shade of blue for the front door. "That's nice, sweetheart," Mom said absently, not even looking up from Ethan's science fair project about solar systems. Dad gave me a quick pat on the head before turning back to help Ethan calculate planetary distances. That became the pattern. Ethan's academic achievements were celebrated with family dinners and calls to grandparents. My artistic talents were met with polite smiles and refrigerator displays that lasted exactly 1 week before being replaced. When I won the school art contest in 5th grade, Mom forgot to pick up my ribbon from the office. When Ethan made honor roll that same semester, Dad took him out for ice cream and bought him a new bicycle. Our backyard was my sanctuary. I'd spend hours under the old oak tree, sketching the changing seasons or writing stories about brave princesses who didn't need rescuing. Sometimes I'd catch Dad watching me through the kitchen window, and for a moment, I'd think he was proud. But then Ethan would call for help with homework, and Dad's attention would shift like a spotlight following the star of the show. The disparity wasn't always obvious. We took family vacations to Lake Michigan every summer, and both Ethan and I got birthday parties and Christmas presents. But the subtle differences were there, embedded in every conversation. When relatives asked about us kids, Mom would launch into detailed updates about Ethan's latest achievements while mentioning me almost as an afterthought. "And Claire's doing well in school too," she'd add, "the way you might mention that the weather was pleasant." High school only amplified the divide. Ethan was class president, captain of the debate team, and headed for an Ivy League education. I was the quiet girl who painted sets for school plays and tutored struggling students during lunch. My guidance counselor called me gifted with people, which was apparently code for not academically exceptional like your brother. The college fund conversation happened during my junior year. I was 17, sitting at our kitchen table working on a scholarship application for art school, when I overheard my parents talking in hushed tones about money. "Ethan's going to need every penny we can give him," Dad said. "Harvard isn't cheap, even with partial scholarships." "What about Claire's fund?" Mom asked. "The market's been volatile," Dad replied. "We might have to make some adjustments." I didn't think much of it then. The stock market was something adults worried about, like taxes and mortgage rates. I trusted that my college fund was safe, just like I trusted that my parents loved both their children equally. Looking back, I realized that was the moment my future was decided not by market forces, but by a deliberate choice about which child was worth the investment. But I was still naive enough to believe in fairness, still young enough to think that love was measured in hugs and bedtime stories rather than college funds and career support. It would take years for me to understand the true cost of being the other child, the one whose dreams were considered expendable when sacrifices had to be made. As I stood in that Italian villa years later, watching my brother's perfect wedding crumble under the weight of our family's secrets, I thought about that 17-year-old girl working on scholarship applications. She had no idea what was coming. She still believed her parents would catch her if she fell. The divergence became impossible to ignore after graduation. Ethan sailed into Harvard on a partial scholarship, the rest covered by what my parents proudly called strategic financial planning. Meanwhile, I enrolled at Illinois State University, a perfectly respectable school that happened to cost a fraction of an Ivy League education. When I asked about my college fund, Dad's face grew tight around the eyes. "The market took a hit during the recession," he explained, not quite meeting my gaze. "We lost about 60% of what we'd saved for you. I'm sorry, sweetheart. You'll need to take out some loans." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Parents didn't lie about college funds. They didn't sacrifice one child's future for another's. At least, that's what I told myself as I signed loan documents and applied for work-study programs while Ethan posted photos from Harvard Yard on social media. By the time I graduated with my teaching degree, Ethan had already landed a position at a tech startup in Silicon Valley. His monthly salary was more than I made in a year at Maplewood Elementary. Within 3 years, when the company went public, he was wealthy enough to buy our childhood home outright, not that he wanted to. He preferred his penthouse apartment in San Francisco and his weekend house in Napa Valley. Family gatherings became elaborate showcases of Ethan's success. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday celebration somehow centered around his latest business venture or investment opportunity. Mom would spend hours preparing his favorite dishes, and Dad would lean forward intently as Ethan explained cryptocurrency or artificial intelligence trends that went completely over their heads. "Tell them about the Tesla," Mom would prompt during dessert, her eyes shining with vicarious pride. "Oh, that," Ethan would say with practiced humility. "I just got the new Model S. It drives itself. Basically, technology is incredible these days." Dad would nod sagely, as if he personally understood the engineering behind autonomous vehicles. Always ahead of the curve, our boy. Meanwhile, I'd sit quietly, picking at my pie, waiting for someone to ask about my students or the literacy program I'd helped implement at school. The questions, when they came, felt perfunctory. "How's teaching going? Claire?" Mom would ask while already reaching for the coffee pot. Before I could answer with more than, "Fine, thanks," the conversation would somehow drift back to Ethan's world of IPOs and stock options. The pattern was so ingrained that I barely noticed it anymore. I'd trained myself to find fulfillment in small victories, the struggling reader who finally grasped phonics, the shy kid who found confidence through art projects, the parent who thanked me for seeing their child's potential. My life had meaning, even if my family couldn't see it. But the financial reality of my choices became harder to ignore with each passing year. While Ethan bought investment properties and took European vacations, I clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old Honda with a rattling exhaust pipe. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage, splitting utilities and wondering if I'd ever be able to afford a house of my own. The visits to my parents' house became exercises in careful navigation. I'd park my shabby car behind Dad's pristine Buick and brace myself for the inevitable comparisons. "Ethan just closed on another deal," Mom would announce before I'd even taken off my coat. "Something about blockchain technology. He's flying to New York next week to meet with investors." I learned to smile and nod, to ask appropriate follow-up questions, to play the role of the supportive little sister who was genuinely happy for her brother's success. And I was happy for him. Mostly. Ethan had worked hard, made smart decisions, taken calculated risks that paid off. He deserved his success. What bothered me was the growing sense that my parents viewed our divergent paths as inevitable, even appropriate. as if Ethan was always destined for greatness while I was meant to be satisfied with modest achievements and financial struggle. During one particularly painful Christmas dinner, when Ethan casually mentioned his bonus was enough to buy a small house, Dad actually said, "Some people are born to build empires, others to serve communities. Both are important." The implication was clear. Ethan was the empire builder. I was the community servant. One trajectory was celebrated, the other tolerated. I started noticing other things too. When Ethan mentioned needing help with a down payment on his second property, Mom and Dad exchanged meaningful looks and somehow found $20,000 to loan him. When I mentioned that my student loans were causing me to struggle each month, Dad suggested I look into income-based repayment plans and maybe take on some tutoring jobs. The birthday gifts became another source of quiet humiliation. Ethan received expensive electronics, weekend getaways, and one memorable year, a contribution toward his business venture. I got thoughtful but modest presents books, scarves, gift cards to Target. Nothing wrong with any of it, except the message it sent about our relative worth in their eyes. But I kept quiet, kept playing the good daughter, kept pretending the inequality didn't cut deeper each year. I told myself that love wasn't measured in dollars, that my parents' pride couldn't be quantified by gift receipts or loan co-signings. I almost convinced myself it was true. Until the wedding announcement changed everything. The engagement announcement came on a crisp October evening during our monthly family dinner. Ethan arrived 30 minutes late, which was unlike him, fidgeting with his phone and barely touching Mom's famous pot roast. Finally. He cleared his throat and produced a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "I have something to tell you all," he said, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "I asked Olivia to marry me last weekend. She said yes." The eruption of joy was immediate and overwhelming. Mom actually shrieked, clapping her hands together like a teenager at a boy band concert. Dad stood up to shake Ethan's hand, then pulled him into one of those awkward masculine hugs. I forced a smile and offered my congratulations, genuinely happy for my brother, despite the familiar sting of being relegated to observer status in my own family's celebrations. Olivia Carter was everything my parents had dreamed of in a daughter-in-law. She was a pediatric surgeon at UCSF, beautiful in that effortless way that came from good genes and expensive skincare. Her father was a renowned cardiac surgeon. Her mother chaired several charity boards in Marin County. When she smiled, which she did often, it was with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "We're thinking of a destination wedding," Olivia announced the following week, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured enthusiastically. "Somewhere romantic and intimate. We found this incredible venue in Amalfi Coast Villa Serafina. It overlooks the Mediterranean and has this gorgeous terrace where we could hold the ceremony." The price tag, when it eventually emerged, was staggering, not just for the venue, but for everything that came with a destination wedding in Italy: flights, hotels, extended stays for wedding activities, custom dress fittings, rehearsal dinners that cost more than my monthly salary. "Claire, we'd love for you to be my maid of honor," Olivia said during our next family gathering, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I know we haven't spent much time together, but you're Ethan's sister, and family is everything to me." I should have felt honored. Instead, I felt trapped. The maid of honor responsibilities for a destination wedding were extensive and expensive. The dress alone, a custom creation by some designer whose name I couldn't pronounce, cost $1,200. Add in the bachelorette party in Tuscany, the flight to Italy, hotel accommodations for a week, and various pre-wedding events, and I was looking at expenses that exceeded my entire emergency fund. "I'm so excited," I managed to say, calculating frantically in my head. Though I have to admit, the costs are a bit overwhelming on a teacher's salary. Olivia's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, don't worry about that. We want this to be perfect, and we know everyone will make it work. It's going to be magical." I waited for someone my parents, anyone to acknowledge the financial burden this placed on me. Instead, they launched into enthusiastic discussions about Italian venues and wine pairings as if money were no object for anyone involved. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a growing sense of dread. Even with careful budgeting and picking up extra tutoring sessions, I'd need to drain my savings and probably take on credit card debt to participate in my brother's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd be going into debt to celebrate Ethan's happiness while he could afford to pay for the entire wedding without touching his investment portfolio. When I tentatively brought up my concerns to my parents the next week, their response was both predictable and crushing. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," Mom said, not looking up from the wedding magazine she was flipping through. "Ethan's found such a wonderful girl. We all need to do our part to make this special." "I understand that," I replied carefully, "but maybe we could look at ways to reduce some of the costs. The bachelorette party, for instance." "Claire," Dad's voice carried that tone of mild disappointment I knew so well. "Your brother has worked hard to build a successful life. He deserves to have the wedding he wants. This is important." "What about what I can afford?" "You'll figure it out," Mom said dismissively. "You always do. Besides, this will be good for you learning to manage larger expenses, networking with Olivia's family and friends. Think of it as an investment in your future." An investment in my future. The phrase stuck with me as I walked to my car, fighting back tears of frustration. Everything in my family was framed as an investment: Ethan's education, his business ventures, his wedding. But my financial struggles were character-building exercises, opportunities for personal growth through hardship. I started picking up extra work wherever I could find it. Tutoring sessions after school, weekend gigs helping neighbors with their taxes, even a brief stint helping Mrs. Patterson organize her late husband's financial records. Every dollar went toward the Italy Fund, as I'd started calling it in my head. The wedding planning consumed our family gatherings completely. Every conversation revolved around venue details, guest lists, and transportation logistics. I watched my parents dive into the planning with an enthusiasm they'd never shown for any of my life events. Mom spent hours on the phone with caterers and florists. Dad researched Italian customs and currency exchange rates. "Well, we want to make sure everything is perfect for Ethan and Olivia," Mom explained when I asked why they were so involved. "This is probably going to be the social event of the year for their circle. First impressions matter." Meanwhile, I was working 7 days a week and eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights. When I mentioned being tired during one family dinner, Ethan finally seemed to notice my situation. Hey, if you need help with anything, just let me know," he said quietly as we cleared dishes. "I know this is expensive." For a moment, I felt hopeful. Finally, someone acknowledged what I was going through. But when I started to respond, Mom's voice cut across the kitchen. "Oh, don't you dare offer to pay her way. Ethan, she needs to learn financial responsibility. This will be good for her character." My brother's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Dad joined the conversation. "Your mother's right. Claire's a grown woman. She can handle her own obligations." I watched my brother's expression shift from concern to reluctant acceptance. He nodded slowly, then gave me an apologetic shrug that somehow hurt worse than outright rejection. That's when I knew, with crystalline clarity, that my family viewed my financial struggles not as a problem to be solved, but as a feature of my character to be preserved. The moment that shattered my world happened on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 2 months before the wedding. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork Olivia needed for the Italian venue customs forms that required notarization, which I'd handled since I had connections at the school district office. Mom wasn't home, but I could hear voices coming from Dad's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Ethan's laugh mixed with my father's deeper tones. I was about to announce myself when I heard my name. "Claire's really struggling with all these wedding expenses," Ethan was saying. "I feel terrible watching her work herself to death just to afford being in the wedding party." I froze in the hallway, my hand halfway to knocking on the door frame. "She'll be fine," Dad replied dismissively. "Character building, you know. Your mother and I went through plenty of lean years when we were starting out." "But Dad, she's 33 years old. She shouldn't have to choose between financial security and being part of her brother's wedding. I could easily cover her costs without even noticing the expense." There was a pause, and I held my breath, hope fluttering in my chest like a trapped bird. "Absolutely not," Dad said firmly. "Son, you need to understand something about your sister. She's always been the type who needs to earn things to appreciate them. If we just hand her money, she'll never develop real financial discipline. That seems unfair, considering what Dad's voice had an edge now. Well, you and Mom helped me with my down payment on the Palo Alto property, and there was that loan for my startup capital that you never expected me to pay back." My heart began to pound so hard I was certain they could hear it through the wall. Dad cleared his throat. "That was different. Ethan, that was an investment. You've proven you can multiply money, turn opportunities into wealth. Claire's a teacher. She's never going to build anything beyond what she has now. There's no point in throwing good money after bad." The words hit me like physical blows, but what came next destroyed me completely. "Look," Dad continued, "your mother and I made a decision a long time ago about where to place our bets. We took Claire's college fund and invested it in your education and early career. Every dollar we put into you has paid dividends. Claire's path was always going to be modest. It made sense to consolidate our resources where they'd do the most good." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. My college fund. They'd taken my college fund. "You took her college fund?" Ethan's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Don't be dramatic. We made a strategic financial decision for the family's overall benefit. The stock market crash story was easier than explaining complex investment strategy to an 18-year-old. "Dad, that's..." Ethan struggled for words. "That's not right. She's been paying student loans for over a decade because she thought her money was lost in the market. And she's managed just fine, hasn't she? Those loans taught her budgeting skills, made her appreciate her education. If we'd just handed her a free ride like we gave you, she never would have developed any financial backbone." I felt sick, literally nauseous. 15 years of believing my parents had suffered financial setbacks that affected my education. 15 years of student loan payments, of feeling guilty for needing financial aid, of thinking I was somehow less deserving than my brother because the market had simply been unlucky with my timing. "Besides," Dad continued, and his next words would haunt me forever, "don't worry about the wedding expenses. We'll make her pay for everything. It'll be good for her. Build character. She needs to learn that the world doesn't owe her anything just because she's family." Mom's voice joined the conversation, and I realized she'd been there the whole time. "Your father's right. Claire has always been a bit entitled. This wedding will teach her about sacrifice and priorities. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the chance to struggle and overcome." "But what if she can't afford it?" Ethan pressed. "What if she goes into debt?" "Then she'll learn to get out of debt," Mom replied cheerfully. "Character building, like your father said. We've been protecting her from real financial pressure her whole life. Time she learned how the world actually works." I stood there in the hallway, my legs shaking, feeling like I was watching my family through a two-way mirror. For 33 years, I'd believed I was loved, valued, considered an equal member of this family. Instead, I was an experiment in character development, a project to be managed rather than a daughter to be supported. They'd stolen my college fund to invest in Ethan's future. They'd lied to me for 15 years about what happened to that money. And now they were sitting in Dad's study, calmly discussing how my financial suffering would somehow benefit my moral development while ensuring I paid for every expense related to celebrating my brother's happiness. "I don't know," Ethan said slowly. "This feels wrong." "Son," Dad's voice took on that patronizing tone I knew so well. "You're thinking with your heart instead of your head. Claire isn't like you. She doesn't have your drive, your vision, your potential for growth. We learned a long time ago that she's most comfortable in a supporting role. Let her support you by handling her own responsibilities. Trust me, we know what's best for both our children." The conversation continued, but I couldn't hear anymore. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the paperwork, watching the documents scatter across the hardwood floor like pieces of my shattered illusions. I gathered them up as quietly as possible and slipped out the front door without announcing myself. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just learned. My parents hadn't just failed to support me, they'd actively undermined me. They'd taken my future and given it to my brother, then spent years watching me struggle with the consequences while congratulating themselves on their parenting wisdom. I wasn't their daughter. I was their cautionary tale, their object lesson in the importance of financial responsibility. And they genuinely believed they were doing me a favor. For the first time in my life, I understood that my family's love came with conditions I'd never been told about, and I finally realized that I'd been playing a game where the rules were rigged against me from the very beginning. I spent the next week avoiding my family's calls and texts, claiming I was swamped with end-of-semester activities at school. In reality, I was sitting in my tiny apartment, staring at the walls and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Every interaction with my parents over the past 15 years suddenly made sense through this new, devastating lens. By the following Tuesday, the silence had become too obvious to ignore. Mom left increasingly concerned voicemails, and even Ethan started texting. I knew I had to face them, but I also knew I couldn't pretend everything was normal. Something had broken inside me that night in the hallway, and there was no putting it back together. I invited them all to dinner at Romano's, a mid-range Italian restaurant downtown that had been our family's go-to spot for celebrations and serious conversations. The irony of choosing an Italian restaurant to discuss my brother's Italian wedding wasn't lost on me, but I needed neutral ground for what I was about to do. They arrived within minutes of each other, Mom immediately fussing over whether I looked tired, Dad ordering his usual Manhattan, Ethan checking his phone while scanning the menu. Normal family behavior that now felt like watching actors perform roles they'd rehearsed for decades. "So?" Mom said brightly after we'd ordered. "Olivia mentioned you never picked up those customs forms. Everything okay?" I took a slow sip of my wine, gathering courage. "Actually, I did pick them up. I heard you talking about them. All of you." The temperature at our table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan's head snapped up from his phone, his expression immediately shifting to wariness. Dad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Mom's smile became strained. "I'm not sure what you mean, honey," Mom said carefully. "Last Tuesday night, Dad's study, you were discussing how the wedding expenses would be good character building for me, how you'd make me pay for everything." I kept my voice steady, conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. "You also mentioned my college fund. Remember that conversation?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Other diners continued their meals around us, laughing and chatting, while our table became an island of frozen tension. Dad was the first to speak. "Claire, if you overheard something out of context—" "Out of context," I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Which part was out of context, the part where you admitted stealing my college fund to invest in Ethan's future, or the part where you called me entitled for struggling financially while paying for my own education with the money you redirected to my brother?" "We didn't steal anything," Mom said defensively, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the restaurant. "We made financial decisions that benefited the whole family." "Benefited the whole family." I repeated the phrase slowly. "Explain to me how taking my education fund and lying to me about it for 15 years benefited me." Ethan had gone pale. "Claire, I swear I didn't know about the college fund until that night. If I had known—" "But you did know you got help I never received," I interrupted. "The down payment loan that was never really a loan, the startup capital, the constant financial safety net. You knew you were getting advantages I wasn't." "That's different," Dad interjected. Those were investments in proven opportunities. Ethan had demonstrated his ability to what be worth investing in. My voice was getting louder now, and I didn't care who heard. Are you seriously going to sit there and explain to me why my brother deserved my college fund more than I did? Lower your voice, Mom hissed. People are staring. Let them stare. Let them hear about how you stole your daughter's education money and then spent 15 years watching her struggle with student debt while congratulating yourselves on teaching her financial responsibility. The waiter approached our table hesitantly, probably wondering if he should call security. Dad waved him away with an impatient gesture. Yeah, you're being overly dramatic, Mom said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. We did what we thought was best for both our children. Your brother had opportunities that required capital investment. You chose a more stable, predictable path. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I chose to teach because I couldn't afford the art school I wanted to attend. I chose stability because I thought my college fund had been lost to market forces beyond anyone's control. I made decisions based on lies you told me. Sit down, Dad commanded quietly. You're making a scene. No. The word came out stronger than I'd ever spoken to my father in my life. I'm done sitting down. I'm done being quiet. I'm done pretending this family treats me fairly while you systematically undermine my future and call it character building. Ethan reached across the table toward me. Claire, please. Let's talk about this calmly. I want to make this right. I looked at my brother, really looked at him for the first time in years. He seemed genuinely distressed, but also confused, as if he couldn't understand why I was so upset about what seemed like reasonable family financial planning to him. May make it right, I asked. How exactly do you plan to make up for 15 years of student loan payments, for the opportunities I missed because I couldn't afford graduate school, for the house I'll never buy because I'm still paying for an education that should have been free? We can help you now, he said desperately. With the wedding costs, with your loans. With pity money. I shook my head. You want to throw me some scraps after feeding my inheritance to the golden child. That's enough, Dad said sharply. You're being unreasonable and ungrateful. We provided you with a good education and a stable upbringing. What happened to your gratitude? My gratitude died when I learned you've been lying to me for half my adult life. I pulled out my wallet and threw $40 on the table, more than enough to cover my untouched meal. Here's what's going to happen. I'm not going to be in Ethan's wedding. I'm not going to Italy. I'm not going to participate in this family's charade anymore. Claire, don't be ridiculous, Mom pleaded. You can't miss your brother's wedding over a misunderstanding about money. A misunderstanding. I laughed again, that same hollow sound. You systematically dismantled my financial future and called it parenting. There's no misunderstanding here. There's just 15 years of lies catching up with you. I looked at each of them one last time, my parents, who had convinced themselves that emotional abuse was character development, and my brother, who had benefited from their favoritism while remaining willfully blind to its costs. Don't contact me, I said quietly. Any of you. Not until you're ready to admit what you've done and take responsibility for it. Not until you're ready to have an honest conversation about how this family actually works. I walked out of Romano's without looking back, leaving them sitting in stunned silence with their carefully constructed family mythology crumbling around them like house of cards. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free. The aftermath of that dinner was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in my adult life, I'd drawn a clear boundary with my family, but the silence that followed felt like falling into a void. My phone buzzed constantly for the first few days, missed calls from Mom, lengthy texts from Dad explaining their side of the story, and increasingly desperate messages from Ethan begging me to reconsider. I ignored them all. Instead, I called my best friend Megan, who'd been watching my family dynamics with barely concealed frustration for years. When I told her everything, the overheard conversation, the stolen college fund, The calculated financial manipulation, her response was immediate and fierce. "I've been waiting 15 years for you to see this," she said during our emergency coffee date at our usual spot downtown. "Your family has been gaslighting you since college. Claire, they made you believe you were the problem when they were the ones rigging the game." Megan was a social worker, trained to spot dysfunctional family patterns, and she'd never liked how my parents treated me. But she'd also known I needed to see it for myself. "What kills me," I said, stirring my latte mindlessly, "is how they convinced themselves they were doing me a favor, like financial hardship was some kind of gift they were giving me." "Classic narcissistic parent behavior," Megan replied. "They rewrote the narrative to make themselves the heroes of your struggle story." My boyfriend Kyle had a different perspective when I told him that evening. We'd been dating for 8 months, and he'd met my family exactly twice both times, leaving with a puzzled expression that he'd been too polite to explain until now. "I knew something was off," he said as we sat on his couch, my head on his shoulder. "The way they talked about Ethan versus how they talked about you. It was like they were describing two different species. One was a success story, the other was a cautionary tale." Kyle worked in finance, and when I explained the college fund situation, his anger was immediate and practical. "That's not financial planning. Claire, that's theft. They stole your inheritance and convinced you to be grateful for the crumbs." Both Megan and Kyle encouraged me to do more than just cut contact. "You can't let them get away with this," Kyle argued. "They need to face consequences, or they'll just keep rewriting history until you're the villain in their story." That's when the idea began to form. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering evidence, driven by a methodical fury I'd never experienced before. I dug through old paperwork, printed email conversations, and requested records from the bank where Dad worked. The paper trail was damning clear documentation of my college fund being transferred to accounts that directly benefited Ethan's education and early career investments. I found the original college savings account statements, showing a balance of over $40,000 that had been accumulated over 18 years. I found the transfer records, moving that money into what my parents had labeled family investment accounts. I even found Dad's old emails to his financial advisor, discussing the strategic reallocation of education funds to maximize family return on investment. The most devastating piece of evidence was a handwritten note in Mom's careful script, filed away with their tax documents. "Seize fund, ease opportunities. Better ROI on proven performer. C will manage fine with loans builds character." They'd literally planned my financial hardship and documented it like a business decision. But the college fund theft, as devastating as it was, wasn't enough. I needed something that would expose the ongoing pattern, the current manipulation. That's when I realized the wedding provided the perfect opportunity. The plan crystallized during a particularly sleepless night. Ethan's wedding would be attended by both families, all their wealthy friends, colleagues, and social connections. It would be the perfect stage to reveal exactly how my parents had built my character over the years. I wouldn't just expose the financial manipulation, I'd expose the entire mythology they'd constructed around it. Let their friends and family hear about the loving parents who stole their daughter's education fund and called it character building. Let Olivia's surgeon father hear about the strategic decision to sacrifice one child's future for another's profit margins. The guest list, which Olivia had shared with me months earlier, read like a who's who of successful professionals, doctors, lawyers, tech executives, other wealthy families from both coasts. These were people who understood investments and financial planning. They'd immediately grasp the implications of what my parents had done. I began preparing meticulously. I organized all my evidence into a coherent narrative, practicing my delivery until I could tell the story calmly and factually. I didn't want to come across as an unhinged sister having a breakdown. I wanted to present the truth with the same measured tone my parents used when explaining their financial strategies. The hardest part was deciding whether to warn Ethan. Part of me wanted to spare him the public humiliation, but I realized that protecting him from consequences was exactly the dynamic that had enabled this situation for so long. He'd benefited from my parents' favoritism his entire life. If he truly wanted to make things right, he needed to understand the full scope of what that favoritism had cost. 3 weeks before the wedding, as I finalized my travel arrangements to Italy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of power over my own narrative. For 33 years, my family had controlled the story of who I was and what I deserved. They'd cast me as the supporting character in their success story, the cautionary tale that made their achievements seem more impressive. But stories could be rewritten, and sometimes the supporting character decided to take center stage. I booked my flight to Italy with money I couldn't afford, charged the bridesmaid dress to a credit card that was already maxed out, and confirmed my attendance at every pre-wedding event on the itinerary. On the surface, I was playing the role of the dutiful sister who'd had a temporary breakdown but come to her senses. In reality, I was preparing for the most important performance of my life. My family thought they'd won when I showed up to the wedding planning meeting with a forced smile and an apology for my emotional outburst at the restaurant. They thought I'd learned my lesson about speaking out against their version of family harmony. They had no idea I was counting down the days until I could return the favor. Villa Serafina was everything Olivia had promised and more, perched on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, with terraced gardens cascading down toward the azure water. It was the kind of place that existed in travel magazines and rich people's Instagram feeds. The morning of the wedding dawned perfect cloudless sky, gentle breeze carrying the scent of lemon trees and jasmine. I'd spent the week playing my role flawlessly, dutiful maid of honor, gracious sister, financial martyr who'd somehow scraped together the money to celebrate her brother's happiness. I participated in every event with a smile that never quite reached my eyes, helped Olivia with last-minute details, and listened to my parents hold court with the other guests about their successful children. "Both our kids turned out so well," Mom had gushed to Dr. Carter, Olivia's father, during the rehearsal dinner. "Different paths, but we're proud of both of them. Claire's found her calling in education such important work, and Ethan's built this incredible business empire." I'd nodded along, sipping wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, while mentally rehearsing the speech I'd been perfecting for weeks. The wedding ceremony itself was breathtaking. Ethan looked genuinely happy as he watched Olivia walk down the petal-strewn aisle, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt about what I was planning to do. But then I caught sight of my parents in the front row, beaming with pride and satisfaction, and my resolve hardened. The reception moved to the villa's main terrace as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Round tables draped in ivory linens were scattered across the stone patio, each centerpiece a work of art featuring white roses and trailing ivy. String lights twinkled overhead, and a small orchestra played soft jazz as guests enjoyed cocktails and antipasti. I sat at the family table, making polite conversation with Olivia's relatives and family friends, waiting for the moment when the best man would call for toasts. My folder of evidence sat hidden beneath my napkin, and my phone was loaded with photos of the financial documents I'd discovered. The speeches began as planned. Ethan's college roommate told embarrassing stories about their Harvard days. Olivia's sister spoke about childhood memories and finding the perfect brother-in-law. Dad delivered a rambling toast about family values and the importance of marrying someone who shared your principles. Then the best man looked toward our table. I believe Ethan's sister would like to say a few words. This was the moment. I stood slowly, smoothing my $1,200 dress, and walked to the small platform where the microphone waited. The guests turned their attention to me expectantly, wine glasses raised, ready for the traditional sentimental sister speech. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Ethan and Olivia," I began, my voice steady and warm. "It's been wonderful getting to know Olivia's family and friends this week, and hearing so many stories about how these two amazing people found each other." Polite smiles, nodding heads. My parents looked pleased, probably relieved that I was sticking to the script. Family is everything to Olivia, and I know that's something she and Ethan share, the importance of family support, of parents who invest in their children's futures, of siblings who have each other's backs. I paused, letting the words settle. I've been thinking a lot about investment this week, actually, about the choices parents make and how those choices shape their children's lives. A slight shift in the atmosphere. My parents' smiles became more fixed. For instance, did you know that my parents took my entire college fund, $40,000 saved over 18 years, and gave it to Ethan instead? I said conversationally, as if I were commenting on the weather. They told me the money was lost in the stock market, but actually, they'd made what they called a strategic reallocation to invest in what my father referred to as the proven performer. The silence was immediate and absolute. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the orchestra seemed to falter. "I found the paperwork," I continued, pulling out my phone and projecting the bank statements onto the screen that had been set up for the wedding slideshow. Transfer records, investment documentation, even a handwritten note from my mother explaining that my financial struggles would build character, while Ethan's continued success would maximize family return on investment. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Dr. Carter's face had gone ashen. Olivia's mouth hung open in shock. At the family table, Mom had buried her face in her hands while Dad sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might snap. They've spent 15 years watching me struggle with student loans, telling me I needed to learn financial responsibility, while secretly congratulating themselves on their brilliant financial planning. I gestured toward my parents. Just last month, I overheard them telling Ethan that my wedding expenses would be good for me. "We'll make her pay for everything," they said. Character building. Ethan had gone completely white. He stood up from his seat, his face a mask of horror and shame. "Claire, I swear I didn't know about the college fund until 3 weeks ago," I finished for him. "When you heard them admitted in Dad's study. And what did you do with that information? Ethan, did you come to me? Did you offer to make it right? Or did you just feel bad about it while watching me max out credit cards to pay for your celebration?" The crowd was murmuring now, guests turning to each other with shocked expressions. I could see Dr. Carter whispering something urgent to his wife, both of them staring at my parents with undisguised disgust. "Here's what really breaks my heart," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent terrace. They genuinely believed they did the right thing. In their minds, stealing my education fund and lying about it for 15 years was good parenting. They turned my financial hardship into a family values lesson while spending my inheritance on your business ventures. I looked directly at my parents now. "So, congratulations. Mom and Dad, you successfully taught me about family loyalty. You taught me exactly what I'm worth to this family, exactly where I rank in your investment portfolio. And you taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll sacrifice your future for someone else's profit margins." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then chaos erupted. Guests began talking all at once, some standing to get a better look at the evidence still displayed on the screen, others pulling out their phones to capture the drama. Olivia burst into tears and ran toward the villa, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a silk comet. Ethan started toward me, his face desperate. "Claire, please, we can fix this." "No," I said firmly, stepping back from the microphone. "You can't fix this. Ethan, you can acknowledge it. You can take responsibility for benefiting from it, but you can't fix 15 years of lies and manipulation." I looked out at the crowd one last time at the shocked faces of wealthy strangers who now knew exactly what kind of people my parents really were, at Olivia's family who were probably reconsidering their daughter's choice in in-laws, at my brother who finally understood the true cost of his privileged position. "Enjoy the rest of your reception," I said simply, then walked off the platform and straight toward the villa's exit, leaving behind the most expensive wedding gift I'd ever given the truth. I didn't look back as I walked through the villa's marble corridors, my heels clicking against the ancient stone floors. Behind me, I could hear the chaos I'd left in my wake-raised voices, the scraping of chairs, what sounded like someone sobbing. The sounds grew fainter as I reached the front entrance where my pre-arranged taxi waited, engine running. The driver, a weathered Italian man named Giuseppe who spoke broken English, had been my escape plan from the beginning. I'd paid him extra to wait during the ceremony and reception, telling him I might need to leave early due to a family emergency. He didn't ask questions when I appeared 2 hours ahead of schedule, just nodded and pulled away from the villa as the Mediterranean sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. My phone started buzzing before we'd even reached the main road. Text after text, call after call. I turned it off and watched the Italian countryside roll past the window, feeling simultaneously empty and electric with adrenaline. The aftermath would be brutal. I knew. Social media posts, family friends taking sides, professional consequences for my parents when word spread through their networks. Dr. Carter and his wife would probably spend the rest of the evening questioning whether their daughter had married into a family of financial predators. Olivia would have to decide whether Ethan's complicit silence made him guilty by association. But for the first time in 15 years, the truth was out there. No more carefully crafted family mythology. No more gaslighting about character building and financial responsibility. Everyone who mattered in my parents' social circle now knew exactly what kind of people they really were. The first person to find me was Ethan, naturally. He was waiting in the hotel lobby when I returned to pack my things, still wearing his wedding tuxedo but looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. "Claire, please," he said, standing up from one of the leather armchairs. "We need to talk." I paused in front of the elevator, my room key card in my hand. "Do we?" Because I think I said everything I needed to say. "The wedding is ruined," he said quietly. "Olivia won't come out of her room. Her parents are talking about flying home tonight. Half the guests have already left." "I'm sorry your wedding got ruined," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted to destroy his happiness. I'd just wanted him to understand the price of it. But maybe now you understand what it feels like to have something important to you destroyed by people who claim to love you. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I want to make this right. Tell me how to make this right." "Start by having an honest conversation with your wife about the family she just married into," I replied. "Then have an honest conversation with yourself about how many times you could have spoken up over the years and chose not to. And finally, have an honest conversation with our parents about consequences." The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. Ethan moved as if to follow me, but I held up my hand. "Don't," I said firmly. "This isn't something you can fix with money or grand gestures. Ethan, this is about 15 years of choosing the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. You benefited from their favoritism every single day, and you knew it wasn't fair. You just didn't care enough to do anything about it until it became publicly embarrassing." The doors started to close, but I held them open for one last moment. "Well, when you're ready to acknowledge what really happened, not just the college fund, but the entire pattern of how this family operates, then maybe we can talk. But I'm done being the family scapegoat while you play the innocent bystander." I let the doors close and rode up to my floor in silence. I changed my flight and left Italy the next morning, 8 days earlier than planned. My phone remained off during the entire journey home, and I spent the long flight staring out the window, thinking about the teacher I'd become and the artist I might have been if I'd had the same advantages as my brother. When I finally turned my phone back on in Chicago, there were 67 missed calls and over 100 text messages. Most were from my family, but some were from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, family friends, even a few of Olivia's relatives who'd apparently gotten my number and wanted to express their support. The message that surprised me most was from Dr. Carter himself. "Ms. Monroe, my wife and I want you to know that we think you showed tremendous courage tonight. Some truths need to be spoken, regardless of the timing. We hope you find the peace and justice you deserve." I never did respond to my parents' increasingly desperate messages. 3 months later, I received a certified letter from their attorney. Apparently, they were threatening to sue me for defamation unless I publicly recanted my false accusations. I forwarded the letter to my own lawyer, along with all the financial documentation I'd gathered, and never heard from their attorney again. Ethan tried for a while. Flowers, letters, even showing up at my school once to try to talk to me in person. I had him escorted off the property by security. Eventually, he stopped trying, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Olivia were in marriage counseling, trying to work through the trust issues my revelation had created. 6 months after the wedding, I used the insurance money from a minor car accident to make a down payment on a small house across town. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a tiny yard that was mostly weeds, but it was mine. No family money, no stolen inheritance, just my own hard work and careful saving. I planted a garden in that weedy backyard and started painting again for the first time since college. Not because I expected to become a famous artist, but because I finally understood that my worth wasn't determined by my family's investment portfolio. Some people might say I went too far, that I should have handled it privately, that I ruined an innocent couple's wedding day for the sake of revenge. Maybe they're right, but sometimes the only way to break a cycle of lies is to speak the truth loudly enough that everyone can hear it. I never got my college fund back, and I probably never will, but I got something more valuable. I got my voice back. And for the first time in my adult life, I'm using it to tell my own story instead of playing a supporting role in someone else's. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with some of you out there who've dealt with family favoritism or financial manipulation. I'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect with others who understand these struggles. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about family dynamics and standing up for yourself. Your stories matter too, and together we can break the silence around these difficult family truths.